You don't feel confused because you're imagining things. You feel confused because the dynamic is designed to keep you uncertain. One moment you feel chosen, seen, and deeply connected, and the next you're left questioning what changed, what you missed, and whether it was ever real at all. That constant shift isn't random, it's the pattern. And the hardest part is this: the person at the center of it may never fully choose you, not because you aren't enough, but because they were never built to choose in a stable, final way in the first place. So the real question isn't whether they feel something for you. It's whether you're willing to keep living inside something that only feels like almost. The person being kept in rotation is almost never aware of it in real time, and that is what makes the entire setup so damaging. There is a quiet distortion happening underneath everything, and you can sense it even if you can't fully define it yet. Something feels off. You notice it in the gaps between replies, in how plans seem real until the very last second, then quietly disappear, in the strange emotional contradiction of someone who shows up physically but feels completely unreachable on the inside. It's like warmth without presence, contact without connection. You've likely been trying to explain this feeling to yourself for a long time, weeks, maybe months. But every time you get close to naming it, it slips out of reach again. And that constant uncertainty is not random. It keeps you searching, keeps you engaged, keeps you emotionally invested. But what you're facing is not confusion in the normal sense. It's not mixed signals in the casual way people describe it. And it's not simply a matter of timing, patience, or misunderstanding. If you look at it without softening the edges, what you're dealing with is a pattern, a structured emotional system built by someone who has learned, often unconsciously, that keeping multiple people close, but not too close, feels safer than committing fully to one. There are clear signs of this pattern, and once you recognize them, they stop being subtle. But the real question is whether you're willing to see them without explaining them away. People who maintain multiple emotional connections in rotation don't usually wake up and decide to create chaos. It rarely starts as intentional manipulation. That's an important distinction, because if you reduce it to simple cruelty, you miss what's actually driving it underneath. Most of the time, this behavior is rooted in avoidant attachment patterns, deep emotional conditioning built around fear of closeness, not power, not control, fear. And that distinction matters. Not because it excuses the impact, but because it explains the mechanism. And understanding the mechanism is what allows you to see clearly, instead of staying emotionally entangled in confusion. The first sign is inconsistency, but not random inconsistency. It's patterned. They tend to pull you in most strongly, right at the moment you begin to pull away. Think about that timing. The exact moment you start detaching, focusing elsewhere, or reclaiming your emotional space, they reappear. A message, a call, a memory, something small but precisely timed. It feels almost intentional, like they can sense your shift, but it's not intuition, it's sensitivity to distance. The moment your emotional availability decreases, their system reacts. This is what creates the loop, the almost cycle. Almost together, almost committed, almost chosen. It keeps you suspended in uncertainty just long enough to stay emotionally invested, without requiring them to fully show up. Attachment theory, particularly the work of John Bowlby, explains how early relational experiences shape adult emotional behavior. When closeness in childhood is paired with rejection, inconsistency, or emotional overwhelm, the nervous system adapts by reducing dependency. The child learns, needing others is unsafe. So in adulthood, closeness becomes something to regulate, not surrender to. The result is a push-pull dynamic, where intimacy is desired, but also avoided at the same time. That's why the avoidant individual can seem engaged one moment and distant the next. It's not lack of feeling, it's conflict with feeling. The second sign shows up in how they talk about other people in their life, not you, others. There's often a careful vagueness in their storytelling. You know certain names exist. You know there are connections, histories, interactions, but the details are always incomplete. When you ask for clarity, the conversation shifts, gently, smoothly, almost naturally. You're left with outlines instead of full pictures. This isn't accidental forgetfulness, it's emotional compartmentalization. Different people are kept in different psychological spaces, and those spaces are not allowed to overlap. Because overlap creates exposure, and exposure threatens control of the internal system. In psychological terms, what's being protected isn't privacy, it's structure. A carefully managed internal organization of relationships where each person fulfills a separate emotional function. Carl Jung described the shadow as the unconscious part of the psyche that holds what we refuse to confront: pain, fear, unmet needs, and unresolved emotional memory. For someone with strong avoidant defenses, that shadow is heavily loaded. It contains past rejection, emotional neglect, shame around dependency, and a deep conflict between wanting closeness and fearing it at the same time. On the surface, they may appear stable, even highly capable, independent, composed, functional in almost every external area of life. And in many ways, that competence is real. But internally, there is ongoing emotional pressure that never fully resolves. And when that pressure enters relationships, it gets distributed rather than confronted. This is where multiple connections come in. Each person becomes a different source of regulation. One provides attention and validation, another provides emotional comfort, another offers stimulation or distraction. No single person is allowed to become everything, because everything would require full vulnerability, and that is what the system is designed to avoid. The third sign is where most people start rationalizing what they're seeing, because accepting it directly feels uncomfortable. The avoidant person in your life has never truly made you feel fully chosen, and that's something worth sitting with before you rush to dismiss it. There have been moments, real ones, warm ones, intimate flashes where everything felt aligned, where connection seemed mutual, alive, almost undeniable. Those moments were not imagined, they happened. But moments of closeness are not the same as being someone's consistent, unambiguous choice. And that is the distinction that changes everything. Avoidant individuals can be deeply present in fragments. They can offer intensity, affection, even emotional resonance in bursts. But sustaining choice, day after day, without ambiguity, requires a level of emotional vulnerability that conflicts with their internal wiring. To choose someone fully is to say, out of all possibilities, I am here with you and I accept what that costs me emotionally. That level of exposure is precisely what they tend to avoid. So instead, they hover around it. They come close to commitment without ever sealing it. They give you enough, sometimes 90%, sometimes even more, that it feels like arrival is just around the corner. But the final defining step is never taken. That missing piece becomes the pattern. And slowly, without you realizing it, that absence starts to shape your emotional world. Because human psychology is not built to respond evenly to consistency. It is built to respond intensely to inconsistency. When rewards are unpredictable, when affection, attention, and presence come and go without pattern, the brain becomes more engaged, not less. This is the principle of intermittent reinforcement. And in lived experience, it doesn't feel like psychology. It feels like fixation, like waiting, like something just out of reach that keeps pulling your attention forward. Dostoevsky captured something similar long before psychology gave it a name. He understood that suffering doesn't just hurt people, it organizes them. It becomes structure, it becomes identity. People don't only experience pain, they begin to orient their lives around it. And in this dynamic, that is exactly what begins to happen. The pursuit itself becomes central. At first it's just confusion, then it becomes hope. Then it becomes interpretation, analyzing messages, tone shifts, timing, silence. Eventually, it turns into meaning. The question of will they finally choose me stops being just about the relationship and starts shaping your emotional reality. And that is where the deeper erosion begins. Not in the obvious moments of rejection, which are painful but clear, but in the slow, quiet destabilization of self-perception. You start wondering if something in you is the reason, if you're too much or not enough, if there is some invisible flaw that explains why someone who clearly feels something still cannot fully arrive. But that conclusion is misleading. There is no hidden deficiency in you being exposed here. What you're encountering is not a measurement of your worth. It is a structural pattern that existed long before you entered it. And structural patterns are not changed through effort, patience, or self-adjustment from the outside. The fourth sign is more uncomfortable because it shifts the focus inward. It's no longer just about what they are doing, it's about what you have started becoming inside the dynamic. Pay attention to how you communicate with them compared to how you communicate anywhere else. Notice the edits you make before you speak, the hesitation before you send a message, the mental rehearsals, the careful tone calibration. You begin managing yourself, you soften your needs, you disguise urgency as casualness, you hide intensity behind neutrality, you start performing emotional safety instead of expressing emotional truth. And this doesn't happen because you consciously choose it. It happens because the environment teaches it, repeatedly, subtly, until it becomes automatic. In effect, the relationship begins to shrink your expression of self, not because you were lacking anything, but because the dynamic rewards restraint and punishes clarity. Viktor Frankl, reflecting on extreme human suffering, wrote that even in the worst conditions, human beings retain the freedom to choose their response. But what he also understood is that this freedom depends on psychological stability. When someone is placed in constant uncertainty, when emotional signals are inconsistent, when warmth is unpredictable, when withdrawal follows closeness without warning, the nervous system shifts into survival mode, and in survival mode, clarity collapses. You are no longer choosing freely, you are reacting. And that matters, because inside this kind of dynamic, your emotional bandwidth gets consumed by interpretation. Every message, every delay, every shift in tone becomes something to decode. Your system is always on, always scanning, always trying to predict what comes next. That is not calm attachment, that is chronic activation. And over time it takes a toll that extends beyond the relationship itself. Sleep, focus, emotional presence in other areas of life. All of it begins to feel slightly compromised, slightly displaced, as if part of you is always elsewhere. Bessel van der Kolk's work on trauma emphasizes a simple truth: the body remembers what the mind tries to rationalize. And in dynamics like this, what the body records is not just emotional intensity, it is inconsistency, anticipation, and unresolved tension, a steady accumulation of almost clarity that never becomes clarity. The fifth sign is where everything becomes harder to ignore. Watch what happens when you introduce clarity into the dynamic. Not confrontation, not anger, just calm, grounded honesty about what you need. When you express that you want direction, when you state that ambiguity is no longer sustainable, when you set boundaries around your time, your emotional availability, your expectations, what you're really testing in that moment is not their words, but their capacity for presence under pressure. Because avoidant dynamics often function comfortably only as long as there is no demand for definition, no requirement for finality, no request for emotional certainty. The moment clarity is requested, the system is exposed, and what follows in those moments reveals more than any affectionate gesture ever could. The avoidant person in your life will typically respond to emotional clarity in one of two ways, and neither of them is accidental in effect, even if neither is consciously calculated. The first response is a sudden increase in warmth. Out of nowhere, the distance collapses, the attention returns, messages become more frequent, tone becomes softer, affection feels amplified. It can feel like a breakthrough, like finally reaching the point you've been waiting for. But if you look closely, something important is missing. Nothing structural actually changes. What you're receiving is not a shift in relational foundation, it's a stabilization response, a way to pull you back from emotional withdrawal, without having to confront the underlying issue you raised. It creates relief, but not resolution, closeness, but not clarity. The second response is the opposite, a quiet but noticeable withdrawal. The tone cools, the presence fades, the emotional availability drops, and suddenly you find yourself rethinking everything you just said, softening your stance, minimizing your needs, reassuring them that it's okay, that you don't need much, that things are fine. Both reactions lead back to the same outcome, you returning to a version of the dynamic where nothing fundamentally changes, the system resets itself. And in both cases, whether through warmth or withdrawal, the result is the same. Your need for clarity is absorbed without being answered. From the outside, this can look confusing, but structurally, it is not confusion, it is regulation, a way of restoring a familiar emotional balance where the avoidant person maintains space, flexibility, and low obligation, while still preserving connection. It is not always conscious manipulation, but it is consistent emotional impact. Nietzsche's idea that what does not kill you makes you stronger is often repeated, but frequently misunderstood. He was not describing endurance as strength in itself. He was pointing toward transformation, the idea that suffering only becomes strength when it expands your capacity for life, rather than shrinking it. That distinction is critical here, because there is a difference between suffering that builds resilience and suffering that slowly erodes your emotional foundation. One expands you, the other conditions you to tolerate diminishing returns. And prolonged entanglement in a dynamic built on inconsistency rarely expands anything. It normalizes uncertainty. It teaches the nervous system to interpret anxiety as attachment. It blurs the line between love and instability until the two begin to feel interchangeable. That is not growth. it is adaptation to unpredictability. What makes this pattern so difficult to leave is not the absence of connection, it's the presence of real connection, just not in a stable form. The warmth is real, the chemistry is real, the emotional intensity in certain moments is real. But what is also real is that those same moments are not exclusive. They are not anchored, they are not reserved. They are replicated across multiple connections, each one experiencing a version of that same attentiveness, that same emotional precision, that same temporary sense of being uniquely seen. And this is where misunderstanding often begins, because it is easy to assume that inconsistency means lack of feeling. In reality, it often reflects difficulty with choice. Choosing requires closing doors. It requires accepting limitation. It requires tolerating the discomfort of not exploring every possible emotional pathway. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, that closing-in process can feel internally threatening, almost destabilizing. So instead, doors stay partially open, not fully closed, not fully committed, just open enough to preserve access and closed enough to avoid entanglement. To understand why this pattern develops, you have to look at the emotional learning that often precedes it. A child who grows up in an environment where emotional needs are met inconsistently or where need itself creates overwhelm, rejection, or emotional withdrawal does not interpret that as random. It becomes internalized as a rule. Needing leads to loss of connection. Expressing dependence leads to instability. So the nervous system adapts. It learns self-containment. Emotional self-sufficiency becomes not a preference, but a protective requirement. That adaptation does not disappear in adulthood. It gets carried forward into intimate relationships, where closeness triggers the same internal alarm that once protected the person from early emotional disruption, and so intimacy becomes something to manage rather than surrender to. This is where multiple simultaneous connections often enter the picture, not as conscious strategy, but as emotional distribution. No single relationship is allowed to become central enough to create dependency. Emotional reliance is spread out, diluted, managed. From the outside, it can appear like freedom. From the inside, it is more often emotional compartmentalization, a way of preventing any one bond from becoming strong enough to trigger vulnerability. And yet the people involved in those compartments experience something very different. They experience meaning, intensity, attachment, hope, which is why the impact is so destabilizing, because the emotional reality inside the connection feels coherent, even while the larger structure contradicts it. Over time, this contradiction begins to affect something deeper than emotions. It affects perception itself. You start revisiting your interpretations. You question your responses. You wonder whether you are misreading signals that once felt clear. You begin adjusting your internal compass to accommodate external inconsistency. And slowly, something subtle happens. Trust in your own perception weakens, not in one moment, but through repetition, through cycles of closeness and distance that never fully resolve. This is where the most lasting impact often forms, not in heartbreak, but in self-doubt. Because when your emotional signals are repeatedly contradicted by behavior, you begin to outsource clarity. You look for meaning in the other person's actions more than in your own internal response. You start treating your intuition as unreliable. Rebuilding that trust later is often more difficult than letting go of the person. And eventually, a difficult truth becomes unavoidable. The person you have been waiting for this pattern to transform into something else is not moving toward that transformation through the relationship itself. Because patterns like this are not resolved through emotional proximity, effort, or understanding from the outside. They are only changed through internal recognition and sustained psychological work from the person enacting them. Which means your effort, no matter how patient or precise, cannot complete that process for them. At some point, the question stops being about interpretation and starts being about participation. Not what do they feel, but what does this dynamic require of me to remain inside it? Because whatever the origin of the pattern, its effect is what you are living with. And that effect has consequences for your clarity, your emotional stability, and your sense of self. The final consideration is not about understanding them more deeply. It is about whether the version of you that exists inside this dynamic is becoming smaller, more uncertain, more self-edited, or more grounded, more certain, more whole. Because love in its healthiest form does not require you to abandon your own perception to remain connected. And if a connection consistently asks for that trade, then the most important clarity is not about them at all. It is about what you are no longer willing to normalize. In the end, the clearest truth is also the hardest to accept. You cannot turn inconsistency into commitment by loving harder, waiting longer, or understanding deeper. What you experienced was real in moments, but a collection of moments is not the same as being chosen in a steady, grounded, and unambiguous way. And if someone can only meet you in fragments, then what you're really living inside is not a relationship that is growing, it's a cycle that is repeating. The breaking point always comes when you stop measuring what they say, or even what they sometimes feel, and start paying attention to what is consistently true in their behavior. Because clarity is not found in potential, it is found in pattern. And once you see the pattern clearly, the decision stops being about them, it becomes about you. About whether you continue to shrink your emotional truth to stay inside something uncertain, or whether you finally choose a life where being chosen is not occasional, it is consistent, stable, and real. That is where the ending begins, and where your clarity finally starts to return.